You are listening to the We Are Cousins podcast, a podcast that focuses in South Texas and northeastern Mexico genealogy. I want to thank you for tuning in today, either on the podcast or our YouTube video. And today we have the pleasure of having Art Martinez de Vara, and we're going to be discussing his book, San Antonio Marriages, 1703 to 1846, Matrimony in Colonial Mexican and Republican Texas. It is a very interesting conversation, and before we get started, I want to apologize beforehand. As we were recording this, Mr. Martinez's house alarm was going off, so please excuse the first few times that it happens. And we also have Wellester Alvarado with us, and with nothing else, let's go ahead and get started. But before we get started, I want to thank Las Vías del Norte for sponsoring this episode. Las Vías del Norte Genealogy Group helps you find your ancestors by providing you with online presentations, how-to videos, and publications so you can leave a legacy for your children and their children. Make sure and visit them at lasviasdelnorte.com. Once again, that is lasviasdelnorte.com. And now to our conversation. Well, thank you all for joining us today and listening into the We're Cousins podcast. If you're watching us on YouTube, thank you. Also, don't forget to press like or subscribe to the channel. And today we have a guest. We have Art Martinez de Vara. And last month or the prior month, he released a book titled San Antonio Marriages, 1703-1846. And it's a matrimony in colonial Mexican and Republican Texas. And I know it is a very important book for a lot of us that have family in Texas, especially in the San Antonio area. But I'll let Mr. Martinez introduce himself.
Thank you, Moises. My name is Art Martinez de Vara. I'm an attorney and a historian. Based out of Von Army, Texas, which is near San Antonio. I have a lifetime interest in genealogy and Texas history. My father's family comes from Nuevo Leon. Been there for a very long time, like a lot of families.
Yay!
And my mother's family is from Texas, going back to the secularization era. So they purchased some land around Mission Espada and been there since the 1780s, 1790s type era. And before that from Coahuila. So anyway, so I've had a deep interest. I think this is my 8th book that I've published. So you learn a lot from each book. Hopefully you get better with each iteration. And this one's probably one of the biggest subject areas that I've tackled. But frankly, there was not a single resources for marriages for San Antonio. Okay? So seen a void, and like a lot of researchers, having to go to these various sources all the time, and my piles of photocopies of records. I thought it might be worth going through and getting everything together, compiled and indexed, and kind of facilitate other researchers as well.
Thank you, Art, for introducing yourself. Before I ask you the next question, just want to let everybody know, guys, we have Wellester Alvarado with us too. Wellester, can you say hi?
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is actually a great source of information, and I'm so happy to meet Art. It's the first time I'm meeting him and getting to know his work on his latest book, The San Antonio Marriages. And big hello from Monterrey, Nuevo Leon, Mexico.
And just so you all know, I first saw the book, The San Antonio Marriages, that Art published somewhere on Facebook. I know he posted it in a lot of groups, but off the bat, I had to have it. I bought it I just clicked buy, bought it, real simple process from Amazon, actually. I don't know if Amazon did the shipping for you, or you just get an order and ship it, but I got a bunch of bookmarks also inside. So that's pretty neat. And like Art was saying, for us researchers, to go out there, look for the records, it takes a lot of time, travel, lodging. Of course, with Corona right now, we can't really do those things. So to have this book, actually, it's a blessing. And I'm going to show it to you guys just so you could see. It's a 9 by 10? The size?
9 by 7, yeah.
Okay, 9 by 7. And it's actually,
Awfully thick.
and let me look how many pages. It's at least, okay, I'm looking at it's at least 500 pages. And it's very
Wow.
thick, and it has all the marriages for the San Antonio area. And I highly recommend that if you guys get a chance, buy it. If you have family from that area, especially from 1703 to 1846. And Art, on our last podcast, we had Maria Elena Laborde, who has ancestors at Guerrero, Coahuila, which used to be, I can't remember the name. It used to be the gateway into Texas. And that's where all the soldiers to the San Antonio area came through. And I was going to ask you, did you come across any of those marriages for that northern part of what is now Coahuila?
Right. Oh, yeah. It's you talking about like Presidio Rio Grande?
Yes.
San Juan Bautista.
Correct.
Yes, actually. So the time frame is 1703 to 1846, and we all know that the first settlers in San Antonio were 1718. So people have asked me, how'd you get 1703? And the reason for that is the Mission Valero records, which is the Alamo, begin in 1703 when the mission is located in Coahuila, down there by Guerrero, and it gets relocated to the San Antonio River in 1718, 1719 era, and they, many of the mission Indians come with the mission, and they bring the marriage books records with them. So,
hey, Art, can I ask something? Can I interrupt really quick? In 1703 or 1706 in San Pedro Springs, which is like 1.5 miles from San Antonio, isn't that the hubbub of the initial origins?
Correct. Yeah, of the city. Yeah. So I mean, it's a fascinating story. There's an expedition going to East Texas to Los Adayas, and as they're coming through the San Antonio area, they encounter this Indian refugee camp, if you will, called Rancheria Grande. And what we have is the native peoples of Coahuila and what's today Tamaulipas and South Texas are feeling the encroachment and pressure of the Lipan Apache onto their traditional areas, and of course the encroachment of the Spanish moving northward and the disease that come along with that. And so they've banded together in this defensive rancheria or encampment. And one of the priests that's along the way recognizes some of the Indians. They had been converted back in Coahuila and had apostated or left and gone back into the wilderness. And a specific one, his name was Juan Rodriguez, is what they called him. He was a Jarame Indian. And he said, you know what, we're having a tough time here. He's explaining what's going on. He said, why don't you guys build a mission for us here on the San Antonio River? And I can bring some of my folks in with you. So the friars get excited. They write back to their mother house down in Querétaro, and it kind of this whole project begins of this kind of a midway point between.
Was that the Masoneta or the priest Masonet or Masoneta?
Yes, I believe. Yeah. That's and that's kind of how the origins of it. So there is this early tie between those northern Coahuila settlements and missions in Texas, and as you know, the whole settlement pattern of northeastern Mexico and South Texas, follows the same families. So the founding families of Saltillo become some of the early families in Monterrey, become and the same pattern flows here. So those same settlers, or maybe a few descendants removed, then are some of the early soldiers and settlers in San Antonio, and you see a similar pattern among the indigenous. You've got a lot of the Coahuila, the native peoples of Coahuila are being pushed north of the Spanish frontier and move into South Texas. So we see a lot of the natives that go into the missions here in San Antonio originate down there. They're originally from Coahuila, and they've been moving here, and they finally decide, hey, we're gonna give this mission life a try. So there's a lot of dynamics going on, and you see that in the marriage records with the intermixing of people. You see intertribal marriages in the mission records. Everybody wants to be an Espanol on paper, but there's actually few Spaniards up here. So everyone is intermixing. It's a frontier place, and you see that very intimately in these marriage records.
I was researching once a Flores family from San Antonio. All the Flores are related, and I thought they were from this area. Well, it turns out they were related, but the Flores from that particular family went from Coahuila straight to San Antonio. Right. And then the other branch went to Monterrey and then to Las Villas del Norte, and then, moved up to South Texas. So that's something, that we're related to almost all Hispanics in San Antonio, but it's the same migration pattern, the Saltillo and then Nuevo León. Right. And then, they moved up north. And we just recently in January, we read the Spanish Texas 1519 to 1821 by Donald Chipman. Yes. And that's actually another excellent book if anybody out there is interested in the history of Texas. It talks more about San Juan Bautista and the settling of Central Texas and East Texas. For South Texas, basically, deep South Texas, because I know some parts in San Antonio, people consider themselves South Texas too. Well, deep South Texas, it's more the Escandon colonization. So right. By reading a book about Escandon, that covers like deep South Texas. And I know you have, there's some marriage petitions in the book. There's marriage investigations. And the marriage investigations, I wanted to ask you, do they talk about if they were related by blood, and do they include more generations than just the couple?
The dispensations.
Yeah, correct. So yes, the marriage investigations are when individuals are closely related, either by blood or by marriage, or there's some kind of perceived possible impediment to the marriage. And so, so there'll be testimony there on their kinship or prior marriage or prior betrothal. Sometimes there'll be, sometimes these are presidial soldiers that have recently moved in to the area, and so nobody knows them. And so the traditional bands and those types of things aren't. Yes.
Are those dispensas from Guadalajara?
Yes. So under the colonial structure, the Spanish and then the later Mexican structure was a juridical hierarchy. It wasn't administrative like we have today in the United States. So you would have had your, in Texas was assigned to the Audiencia of Guadalajara, not Mexico City. Any kind of appeal that would go up, sorry, I don't know what's going off in the alarm here, would go through Guadalajara. And so those were the records are found there. So, when you're doing your genealogical research, it's helpful to understand, the legal process, where appeals would have gone, and so you can locate records more easily that way. But when you read through those, there's some really interesting ones. There are objections. There's a classic case where the priest of San Fernando is trying to marry essentially an adoptive, an orphaned Indian young man to a Spanish girl, and the uncles come in and object and say, "Oh my gosh, it's gonna bring shame to the family to have a Spanish girl marry an Indian." And you get this, you get to kind of this in-depth investigation, but it's a nice survey of racial attitudes, the casta system, and all of that of the time, kind of illustrated in a real world case. It's also really important to understand, the legal framework of marriage of the time. And so I put a lot of I try to address that in the introduction, kind of give a backdrop of the Catholic institution of marriage, because these are all Catholic records, how it evolved, and so people could understand the process, And so you have this two-stage process that evolves after the Council of Trent, which is in the early mid 1500s. Marriage is a unique sacrament in the Catholic Church because it's not bestowed by a priest; it's bestowed by the two participants upon each other. So, in ancient and medieval times, you didn't need a priest; you could just marry one another. But there are issues that develop, in particular clandestine marriages, and so the church kind of infuses itself and creates this structure, things we know today as bands of a liturgical ceremony surrounding it, so the priest can be an official witness. You'll see these Latin phrases in the records, in facie ecclesia, in other words, in the face or before the church. So it's a public wedding that's acknowledged by the church. And so, I provide that introduction so you can understand some of these records, why certain marriages are being investigated, why some, have petitions, why some are rejected, because there's impediments, why a marriage promise is binding. That's an issue that comes up where a man will ask someone to marry him, and then 2-3 months goes by, he
changes his mind.
He asks somebody else to marry him. Well, she has but she could take him to court, and he has to be released of that obligation because marriage begins at betrothal, and it's kind of completed at the end of the process, and that that comes all the way back from biblical tradition. If you talk about Mary and Joseph, she's married in the sense that she's promised. She's had her betrothal. And so that idea is still with them in the 1800s. You also get into some peculiarities in Texas because of a lack of priests. So specifically in Austin's colony, right? In Austin's colony, he's bringing in these Anglos and these American immigrants. They promise to become Catholics and learn Spanish and become loyal Mexican citizens. And married men get quite a significant.
Art. And Art, the reason I was asking you about the marriage dispensations or the marriage investigations is because I did notice that in the introduction. It's a good about 20-30 pages where Art, it's titled Introduction, Marriage Law and Customs in Early San Antonio, Texas. And I think it's a valuable addition to the book because he helps us explain why those documents were actually made and recorded in the first place. So I think it's a valuable addition to the book. And I highly recommend anybody, especially if you have family in that area, to get a copy of the book. Now, something I wanted to ask you, how many Anglos did you find getting married in those records prior to 1836?
There's actually only a handful. There's not, off the top of my head, I couldn't say specifically, but it's
are any of those last names still in San Antonio?
Probably. There's far more French, or
right.
There's even some free Africans, which are really interesting. There's a gentleman there who's from Ghana who marries an enslaved woman, and he's free.
Wow.
So there are several, and I know some of them can be traced.
And I was wondering because a lot of people don't know, but Stephen F. Austin actually became a Mexican national, and they were supposed to abide by the laws of Mexico and also by the religion. And at that point, the religion was Catholicism. And I was just wondering, did they actually shed their religion and started getting married by the Catholic Church? Or were they probably just living out of wedlock until later on the institutions were established?
Right. Well, there's different groups of Anglos. There's those who travel legally, part of the Austin 300, the formal colonists. And for those, yes, they have to abide by the rules. If they are married, it has to be recognized by the Catholic Church as a valid marriage. And if they're married, they get a much larger land grant than if they're single. So marriage becomes a very important aspect of land grants and why people are immigrating. So oftentimes families will come in, they'll get their large land grant, and they'll have, young adult sons, and other families will have young daughters, and they're trying to intermarry in order to get larger land grants. But there's a chronic shortage of priests, specifically in even in San Antonio and in Austin's colony. And so they developed a very unique response to that. It only exists in Texas in this time frame, and it's called marriage by bond. And what a marriage by bond is a groom would go to the local alcalde, and in Austin's colony, it was Stephen F. Austin, but they would go to the alcalde and they would post a cash bond. Just kind of like today, you post a bond to get out of jail. You would go in and say, I pledge 1,000 reales, and I promise to marry so-and-so when a priest is available. Wow. And the alcalde would give you a bond, which allowed you to cohabitate, and then they would allow you to qualify for your land grant status. And it promised to have that your children would be legitimate, and it kind of prevented that social stigma of just shacking up of the time. But it became very controversial because it wasn't.
In what year did that start?
In the 1820s, and it lasted throughout until the Republic of Texas. And so one of the first acts of the Republic of Texas was to formally legitimize all marriages by bond. And the state legislature had to keep redoing this or reaffirming it. I think the last legislation on it was like as recently as the 1960s. Wow! Because there was issues of inheritance, there was issues of who was legitimate and illegitimate. A lot of these folks, especially they moved in from the United States, left families, abandoned families, and so there's questions of is the new marriage, is the second marriage legitimate? When does the second wife become? And so when everyone dies, who are the heirs and how does it pass? And so all this stuff is heavily litigated, beginning, in the mid 19th century onward. So there are marriages by bond. The unique thing about marriage by bonds is there's no case where a bond was called in. So apparently everybody kept their word who had a marriage by bond. But that's a very uniquely Texan phenomena, marriage by bond.
That's a pretty interesting fact. In Mexico, there was also a scarcity of priests. And so people used to get married or baptized, if not months, years later, right, until a priest came to town or they went to the city. And right, but they didn't do anything like that. That's pretty interesting. The bond theory. Mm-hmm.
Wow, like I had no idea that actually happened. I had heard in Mexico, especially, that once the bride or the groom gave their word to marry each other, it was like a contract, and they had to go with it, or they had to pay a penalty to get out of it. And that did happen in Saltillo in several cases. Now, these bonds, have they survived? Are they found in the Bear archives, or where did you come across them?
You can't. There's only a handful from San Antonio. I mean, most of them. The concentration of them are in Austin's colony in San Felipe, but they exist. Yeah, you can. There are those that survived, and there's a book called Marriage by Bonds, and the author escapes me, but there is a book on the practice, the phenomena, and they have examples in there of the book, in the book of it. But it's kind of a very Anglo-American solution. You have a very, again, at this area of Texas, you have these two cultures colliding, two legal systems coming together, two religious systems coming together, and you get these unique hybrid outcomes often. And so again, as a trained attorney in the Anglo-American tradition, that's a very, that's how an American solution of an American attorney will post a bond, and everything will be fine and we'll get it done. It may not be a natural thing for a Spanish attorney, to come across. But you're right. Even in the Spanish or in the canonical system, a marriage promise is binding. And so so you could sue for damages. You could sue for enforcement. To force it, or if the groom tried to marry a different woman, he could be found to be not eligible because he is betrothed to another, and he has to resolve that marriage contract before he can enter into a new one.
And that's something very interesting with Texas. Like, it adopted a lot of the Spanish, I guess, form of laws, but it also included a lot of the Anglo ones. So it's just a mixture, and it still survives to today, a lot of those things.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Okay. Well, you see it in the records, which is kind of why I laid out that introduction, because you have the early mission records where you see a lot of challenges of the missionary friars trying to take these indigenous forms of marriage, which included polygamy and polyamory and all these other solutions. They use Levitite marriage, where if a brother would die, then his brother would inherit the wife. And the Coltecan Indians practiced infanticide. They would, because they lived in amid scarcity, they would often kill the daughters, and there was a scarcity of women, and so you have a lot of marriage practices where a woman becomes a widow and she might be legally bound to marry the brother, and so forth and so on. This stuff is prohibited by Catholic law, and so the early records, you see these missionary friars trying to take these indigenous customs and practices and forcing them or making them adhere to Catholic morals and customs. And so there's a lot of challenges there. Then we see this influx of settlers. You see a lot of issues with race and castas and that type of scenario where, for example, the case where the uncles of the Spanish girl are objecting to her marrying an Indian. And you see these issues of marriage by bond. A lot of these immigrants were originally Protestants, and they're moving in and they're trying to adhere to the law, at least at a superficial level. And then the records go into the Republic of Texas period. So we also include all of the Republic of Texas marriage licenses, and that's why it ends in 1846. Even though Texas joins the United States in 1845, the Bexar County clerk keeps issuing licenses under the Republic of Texas until 46. And so you see the first introduction. The Republic of Texas passes a law, and the phrasing is still in the law today of a minister of the gospel, because they were no longer Catholic only. So any minister of the gospel can or a justice of the peace. And so then now you start seeing the very first Protestant marriages in these records. Usually they're German settlers from what's now New Braunfels in that area, but they're still at that time part of Bexar County, and so they're found in the Bexar County records. And again, you start seeing this intermixture between the Tejanos and the Anglos and the Germans and those folks that are moving in towards the later part of the record. So you can kind of trace in the marriage records, this progression of the legal environment, going from the most primitive just mission and really no government, all the way through until the very last record where we're still part of the United States, but they're still operating as the Republic of Texas. That transition period is where it ends.
I want to ask you, how many marriages or how many records can we find in the book?
Great question. Let me reference my book. I didn't have that memorized. We are, we're well over 1,700. So there's 1,751 records, and there's a few indexes. We've got I think in addition to the records, I think one of the most valuable part of the book is the index. It took us 6 weeks, and that included we had to hire some folks out of Mexico to help us index it all. So we index every name and every word other than prepositions and whatnot. So in the description, whether it says Espanol or widow.
Question, Art.
Yes.
The people from the Canary Islands, at what year did they start coming, or were they from the very beginning coming?
No, the Canary Islanders come in. It was the 17th. I don't want to misspeak here. 31 when they found the Villa of San Fernando. But before that, there were presidial. The presidio was already here, and the missions were here. So
Okay.
and at the time, they were legally different entities. So the
Really?
missions start first, and they have a geographic territory of 3 leagues, right? And there's 5 missions that get started. And then there's a presidio to guard those missions. And then later, the Canary Islanders come and form the Villa of San Fernando, which evolves into San Antonio. And then San Antonio eventually incorporates those other villages. But there's a period of time where there's an alcalde and a council for San Fernando, which we know is San Antonio, and an Indian alcalde and council for Mission Valero, one for San Jose, one for San Juan, and so they're distinct political entities.
Wow.
Following secularization, and it's only later that they're put together as a single city.
Yeah, and from what I was reading, the very early settlers had some resentment with the Canary Islanders because I guess they got more from the, Spanish government than they did. But and then later on, they all intermarried into each other's families, and that went away. So I thought it was very
I think you see a cultural clash. Plus, there's also a clash of political rights. So the Canary Islanders are incentivized to come. So they're given Hidalgo status. They're given water rights, and their ability to create this government. The presidial soldiers. I'll be honest. Frontier service was generally a punishment. So there are people that are born on the frontier and continue to serve. But I'll give you an example. I have another book that came out this recently on. It's a biography of Francisco Ruiz, and he's the commander at the Alamo, and he prosecutes his quartermaster for embezzlement. Goes through this big process, his whole trial, convicts him, and his punishment is frontier service. His current assignment. I think these presidial soldiers, resent the fact that they're not able to access some of those rights, and access to the, San Pedro Creek and the San Antonio River. The irrigation rights was a big thing, especially in the early years. And as the presidio soldiers retired, they began forming their own little community around the presidio. Which was separate and distinct from San Fernando, and there's these conflicts, and it's not resolved for a generation or two. When finally the like you said, through intermarriage, and where the propios, where the propios are like public lands that are leased, and that's one form of revenue for the city government. The big issue is let's sell off the propios to these other non-Canary Islander peoples and allow them to farm and have irrigation rights and whatnot. And so, but yes, early on, it's very contentious. And the Canary Islanders are also notorious for being highly litigious. They would sue. And so if you were on the outs with them, I could see how there would be tension. Yes.
Watch out. All right, one more question.
Sure.
Not one more, but another question. In this really, really great effort and work that you've accomplished with this source, did you do it for your family tree? Did you do it for other people, and if you did do it for your own genealogy, did it satisfy your needs?
Well, yes. I mean, in a sense, I did it for my own family because I'm a genealogist. I love genealogy. I've been through these records myself. As any genealogist knows, the job never gets smaller. It always, everyone you discover, it doubles your workload. So you get these more and more, it ever growing, right? It's exponential, which is one of the reasons I think we all love it. You're never fully satisfied. But one of the frustrations that I've had over the years is that it's, where especially when you're not really sure where to locate someone, were they at San Fernando? Were they at one of the missions? Maybe, there's gaps in the records. There's pages that are lost, whatnot. So maybe they had an investigation. Maybe I can find a petition, all these other things. And so those records are scattered across, multiple sources and different archives. Some have never been published, like the Republic of Texas records. And then just doing other research, as a historian and whatnot, you can glean a lot of information off of Sacramento records. Everything from locating an individual. When I wrote my Francisco Reese book, he's a military commander, and he's all over the place doing Indian negotiations. He's off in war. But if I know he witnessed a baptism on a specific date, I can pinpoint him. Oh, he was in San Antonio. He was at San Fernando Church on this date. I know he's not in Saltillo. I know he's not, in Nacogdoches at that time. So, just having worked with the documents and knowing the challenge and having other genealogists come and ask for help as we do, I just knew that there was this need to kind of consolidate them all into one volume and to index them particularly. So you can more easily locate, and again, a full index of any relationship. So all the priests are in, all the witnesses, all the padrinos, all the.
Wow, that's really important.
Right. If they reference a little rancho somewhere, it's all indexed. If it's in there, you can find it. And so using that index as a tool can help you. I mean, as you saw how big the book is, it's a dense amount of records. Yes, that was the goal of the project, was to make it digestible in one volume.
And at the very end of the book, there's an index of terms. You could actually look for the Native American tribe there and go and look who was getting married from the tribe. Because I know a lot of us are interested in Native Americans. Also, there's an index of names, and it's massive. And the great thing is you don't have to go record by record. By the way, there are full transcriptions, right, of the records?
They're not full transcriptions.
Okay.
Some of them are some of them are not. That would have been like a 2,000 page.
Okay.
But is there a way for them to source it out with the information that you're applying?
Yeah, absolutely. And and with any transcription, translation, you always want to look at the original. And so the way I view this is it's a great tool. This is a great tool to locate, to find, get data, but I would always, I never trust anyone's translations. I always look at the original.
Yeah.
Even in my own work, I look at the originals. My current project right now is to kind of narrowing it down. And so we're working on the Valero records, and we're doing a full transcription, translation, and then cross-reference and annotating everything. And burial records alone are at 550 pages.
Wow.
And so at some point we need to go through all of these records and do full transcriptions, full translations, and cross-index them. It hasn't been done. It's been done in other communities, but not in San Antonio. And so, again, like I said, you learn from each project. That's one of the things that I wish I was able to do in this volume. But I think we're going to have to do it, piecemeal, and it's going to be a series of efforts to get all those fully transcribed and translated.
But this is amazing. This is just great. You have the names, you have the dates, you have the witnesses, you have the name of the priest that married them. Mm-hmm. The only thing that's left out are those templates that the priest used to use on every single marriage record. So you're not really missing anything from that.
Correct. Yeah. So, for example,
this is amazing.
For example, some records will say, the bands were put on this date, and this date.
Yes.
Or we couldn't do 3, so we did 2. So, if you're doing a college dissertation about, really, you're gonna be in the original records anyway. So, but I think it's a great leap forward from what we had available to us, and everything can be improved upon. So, hopefully in the future it'll all be. I don't know, like the Matrix. You can just download it and reference it instantly.
To me,
at least now it's at your fingertips.
To me, this book is invaluable, and it's a time saver. And any serious genealogist that is researching that area needs to have it in their library. And I don't know if you get this question, but a lot of people ask me, "Hey, Moses, why are your books so expensive?" I'm like, when you consider that you're not going to be traveling, you're not going to be paying for hotels, you're not going to be paying for meals, it just makes
The
sense
first trip,
to buy a book.
exactly. The first trip that they take pays for the book big time.
Yeah, and many times over.
Many times over, exactly.
Now, if anybody wants to get your book, San Antonio Marriages 1703-1846, where can they go to buy it?
Well, you can buy it on alamopress.com, which is my website where I sell all my books. You can get it on amazon.com. And there's other small booksellers that sell it, but you can get online and we ship
And that
it.
website was alamopress.com. So if you guys go there, you're going to be able to find this book and other publications that Art Martinez de Vara has published. And believe it or not, I bought a bunch of books at a conference, and there were 2 of your books there.
Oh, really?
There were index books, I think for, what's the name? Born Army?
One Army, yes.
Yeah, I think it was one of those church books and another book. So I was like, wow, like when I read who had published them, I was like, wow, this is cool.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we've I've been doing books for quite a while, and I like getting the primary sources out, for other researchers, and some of that work is so tedious and great. I like. I mean, I'm an attorney, so I love detail. I love digging through records. So I find it enjoyable. I know other people don't. They'd rather just get to the record and move on. And so, that's kind of how I envision it. If I make a book for a fellow genealogist and I can cut 20, 50, 100 hours out of someone else's time, then they have an opportunity to take that, and move on to more advanced research or other research. It's a labor of love. They take quite a while to put together. I mean, I think this one took about 3 years of effort to get it indexed. Locating records. We've got, for example, there's a handful there of Tejanos, of Bejereños in exile. After the Battle of Medina, half the town fled to Louisiana, and so there's a series of records in the Natchitoches records of San Antonio exiles. Those are in there. So I try to piece, all the various records I could find that were related, especially those that are difficult to locate. There was also a marriage manual that was written for the missions in the native language, in the Coltecan language, which I thought was real fascinating. It was in Spanish and Coltecan, and we translated it also into English. And reading through that, you get a glimpse of one, the Coltecan language, because it's we side by side, you can read it and kind of get some understanding of some of the grammar of the Coltecan language, and you can kind of see what I was discussing earlier about the missionary fathers trying to deal with native marriage and social customs by some of the questions that are asked. It's kind of shocking. They ask, have you slept with your aunt and these kinds of things, because those were more common practice. Those were common indigenous practices. And the priest is exhaustively going through these lists of sexual practices that are, or marriage practices that would be very odd from our modern day perspective to ask, but there's a reason for that, and that's because these are some of the native marriage practices, and he's asking, have you participated? And so just reading through the marriage ceremony that was written specifically for the San Antonio marriages gives you an insight into that era of these indigenous customs and lifeways, kind of merging with Spanish Christian lifeways and how the priests are dealing with them at the time. So,
now that you brought it up, do you know anybody that can read those documents, that Tlaxcaltecan, not Tlaxcaltecan, the Coahuiltecan language?
Yes, again, I'm an attorney, so I actually represent the Tapilam Coahuiltecan Nation, which is a group of mission Indians based here in San Antonio.
Wow,
they've got
kudos.
Thank you. And so I'm the travel attorney, and they've got several members who can speak the language.
And I'm interested because I came across a baptismal book for the Reynosa area, which is in Native American language.
Right.
I would love to send you a page to see maybe I don't know if it's Tlaxcaltecan or is the Coahuiltecans, because the Coahuiltecans were in this area, and there's no known Tlaxcaltecan migration into this particular area.
Right.
So I could send you a copy.
Yeah.
Maybe you guys could see what type of language it is, because it would be
Absolutely. That I would be very, I don't know about
that
me,
would be
but
an
I could definitely
amazing
show it around
project.
and see if
That
anybody
would
can
be an
make heads or tails
amazing
of it.
project, because people ask me, hey, Moses, you're always posting about Spanish and the Spanish. I'm like, well, that's what we have. Those are the records that we have.
Right.
And I know in Saltillo, but those are Tlaxcaltecan. There's some also baptismal marriage records in their native language, which is very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Art, no, go ahead.
Oh, I said, from my understanding, there's basically 5 dominant indigenous language groups associated with the missions, and over time they've kind of coalesced into Coltecan was the base, but it evolved into the kind of a lingua franca. But some of the early ones, there's
what are the 5 languages?
I'm sorry.
What are the 5 languages?
See, I knew you would ask that. So if I can remember them, it's Coltecan, Comecrudo. There's the Karankawa. I forget the technical language, but it's the Apache language. I can't forget the name, the Apache language, and I forget.
Comanche.
Maybe towards the latter part, but not in the mission era. It was really the Apache the Comanche were putting pressure on the Apache, and they were moving in into the area. And I think, and so all those different groups enter the mission, and they create this amalgamation of what we know as Coltecan. It comes out of it, but it's got elements and loan words from all 5 language stocks.
That's super interesting. Now I have one question for you. The baptismals, are you guys ever gonna do them, or what John Ogden Leal did, is that okay?
The answer is I would love to do the baptisms. It's obviously a voluminous, in scope.
It's monumental.
This. Yeah, that would probably take a decade to get done, but it needs to be done, and someone needs to start it. Leal did some great work for his time, and for his educational background. I mean, it's fantastic work, but it can be greatly improved upon. There's a lot of things that are missing. As we talked about earlier, when you abstract, these are abstractions of his work, are abstractions of records, and they tend to focus more on the Spanish settlers. So especially if you're looking at Indigenous, there's a ton missing. He didn't have what we have today. Today we have high resolution scans. We've got Photoshop where you can zoom in and play with contrast and pull out information. So for example, right now I'm going through I'm retranscribing the Valero burials, and they're about 10% of the records say illegible, and all but 2 or 3 we've been able to recover, and they're cross-referenced. So if a marriage record or a baptismal record is bleached out or water stained out or torn, by exhaustively going through all the records, they're often cross-referenced. So if a burial is missing, the priest would write in the index of the baptism when the person died. And so there's several records that are completely lost or had been lost in Leal's records. It says torn or missing. We know by reference who it was. Similarly, some of these groups that moved in, especially in Indigenous, like the Cocos and the Karankawas, their baptismal records were lost, but they would cross-reference in the marriage records. And so you can recover a lot of information by digging through all 3 burials, confirmations, baptisms. The baptismal records Leal often leaves out, parents' names, issues like that, or the circumstance. Sometimes someone will be buried and they'll have Latin phrases, in pellicula mortis, or facing death, right? So this person is on their deathbed, they're being baptized. You'll see, an adult Indian in the record. Her name is Francisca, but from her baptism record, you can see she was unconscious. She was baptized conditionally, so probably was never really Christian, and then he'll often give the Indigenous name in the original record, and that's not abstracted. Leal never abstracted indigenous names, or very rarely did them. And so you can recover those names, and sometimes the priest will give the meaning of the name. I came across one a few days ago where it gave the indigenous name, and then the priest said what it meant, and it was like the skunk smells you. This was kind of a strange name, but that was the translation. So again, going back to breaking down these languages and trying to find the roots of the names, it also gives you an insight into how the types of names that the indigenous community would give to each other. So yeah, so there's nothing like going into the original and transcribing and translating that is very challenging. Yeah, but as you know, even the orthography, the shapes of the letters were different. The grammar was different. There's a lot of abbreviations that are used that it takes a while to digest, which is why I think a book like this is very helpful, so that you don't have to acquire all of those skills yourself to dig into the records and find what you're looking for.
And I'm looking forward for the burial ones, because I was going through the marriages of Laredo.
Yeah.
And we had this, there's several soldiers getting remarried.
Right.
And names the first name of the wife and says, se enterró en la capilla de what is it, San Antonio de Valero, which I know it's nowadays the Alamo. Now, where were they buried? Were they buried in the church like it was traditional, or was it a cemetery outside the church?
Right. Well, that's a great question. In fact, we're litigating that right now. I'm representing Tapilam, and we're suing the Alamo over the location of the cemetery. Alamo says it's only in the chapel.
Prior to the 1770s, I think it was a common practice to bury them in the chapel. And then after, I think, 1770, the church stated that they couldn't be buried at the church anymore, and they had to create a Camposanto. And that's, if you look at Mexico, that's when all the cemeteries start. In the 1770s, 1780s, and you start seeing all those cemeteries throughout Mexico.
Sure.
So prior to that,
for example, at Valero, you also have the issue that the current Alamo Chapel that we're all familiar with the famous facade, is the third location of the chapel at that site. And so there were earlier chapels that weren't made out of stone, and people were buried in the chapel. So there's a cluster of burials under what's today the federal building, the post office on Alamo Plaza. There's a cluster of burials around the Long Barracks, because that was used as a chapel. And obviously there's burials in the current chapel and outside in the courtyard, as you described. We've also uncovered records, correspondence describing that there was a Camposanto, a burial site for unbaptized Indians outside of the wall of Valero, because only a baptized Christian could be buried in a Catholic cemetery. So there was a cemetery for the unbaptized. And Valero for a year or two was at what's today La Villita in Maverick Plaza. So there's burials there. The original site of Valero, they just renamed it, but it was Christopher Columbus Park. There's burials there. And then of course there's burials back in the original sites at San Francisco Solano, in Coahuila, in those areas. So the burials, so the whole plaza has been designated as a historic cemetery by the Texas Historical Commission. And they're currently doing excavations there, and they're hitting bodies left and right. So the burials are all throughout the plaza because the chapel itself relocated.
I had heard, I don't remember from who, but that there's a restaurant or a building where somebody did an excavation and you could actually see the bones there, that it just has like plexiglass or to protect it, and they can't touch it anymore.
There's several cases of construction hitting burial sites. There's stuff in the pre-archaeological area in the late 1800s where they describe that. And more recently, I believe the History Shop, which used to be across the street there by the Emily Morgan Hotel, had plexiglass on the floor and you could see the strata. I don't believe it had human remains, I heard that there was, but when you went, there weren't any human remains there. But, that the site there was inhabited, well before there was a mission. They put it there because it was a known campsite, Coltecan or Payaya campsite. So there was burials and habitation there for thousands of years before the mission was even there. So,
Wow.
but yeah, so that's a fascinating discussion. When they built the post office in the 30s, they uncovered about 36 human remains, sets of human remains. Of course, at the time in the paper, it was the centennial. They said, "Hey, we found the heroes of the Alamo," but they were Mission Indians, and those were reburied at San Fernando Cemetery. And there's you can't dig on the Alamo site without hitting human remains.
Art, once again, thank you for being with us today, and thank you once again. And that's it for our podcast. I hope that you enjoyed our conversation. And also, I want to thank Las Villas del Norte once again for sponsoring this show, and encourage you to go visit Las Villas del Norte at lasvillasdelnorte.com. Remember, Las Villas del Norte provides the same benefits that a Genealogical Society does, but on a digital platform. They have newsletters, monthly video presentations, and a lot of other great stuff. Please go ahead and visit them, and thank you. Until the next time. Thank you for listening to the Weird Cousins podcast, a podcast dedicated to South Texas and Northeastern Mexico genealogy.